Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist, with me, Josh Hamilton. Microplastics are everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. They're tiny little particles of plastic that break off from plastics in our clothes, rubbish, packaging, and basically anything plastic. But how much danger do they pose to humans, wildlife, or ecosystems? To discuss this, I was lucky enough to get to chat to scientists Kate Rowley and Katy McCoy, who've been researching the effects of microplastic on wildlife in rivers. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the links in the description below. So, here's Kate and Katy. Let's jump right into this thing. So, Kate and Katy, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on my show.
Thanks very much for having us, Josh.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, well, I mean, as terrifying as the topic is, I'm hoping we can try and help me and my listeners enjoy or understand a little more about microplastics before we're done. So, why don't we just start off for someone who's never even heard the term microplastics, which I hadn't until a few years ago. Why don't you sort of give us an idea of what they are and how they're created?
Yeah, of course. So, as the name suggests, they're very small pieces of plastic, which are classified as being between about 300 microns and 5 millimeters in diameter. The microplastics can either be primary or secondary. They're the sort of two categories we classify them by. So primary are those that are specifically created to be, microscopic in size. So things like microbeads, glitter, for example, they're manufactured to be that size in the first place. And secondary microplastics are those that are formed from the fragmentation of larger pieces of plastic. So things like films, fibres. So if you think of the breakdown of the plastic bag and the fragments you'd get from that, they'd be classified as secondary.
Okay, so
to go on to how they are created as well.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Perfect. So as I've said, they can either be manufactured to be microscopic in size. So that's one way that they can be created, is just the intentional creation of these small pieces of plastic. And they can, as I've said, be formed through a fragmentation of larger pieces, and they're what we call secondary microplastics. They're often formed through biological, chemical, mechanical processes, break larger pieces of plastic down into those fragments, and UV light as well. That has a significant effect on the structure of plastics, because I'm sure you've seen before that if you leave like a bucket out in the garden, for example, it'll go quite brittle because of the light effect, and that will break the plastics down as well.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense. I didn't know that. So, like, how pervasive are microplastics in our water? Like, like if I'm just taking some random water from somewhere in London, for example, like what are the chances that there are microplastics in the water?
I think we've got a very good chance of finding some plastic there. So my work was actually focused on microplastics in the Thames water column, and we found high concentrations of microplastics. And we actually estimated there to be around 94,000 microplastics flowing down the Thames at Greenwich every second. So I think you'd have a pretty good chance if you put a bottle in there and you analysed it. I think you would find microplastics there. They are very pervasive, and we know that they have been found nearly everywhere, from the deepest parts of our oceans to even in soils as well, water.
Wow.
They are everywhere.
94,000 every second. That's such a huge, like, mind-blowing number. That's like, wow, that's basically like a million every 10 or every like 12 seconds. That's a stunning amount. Like, what sort of effect maybe we should move on now to what sort of effect they're having on wildlife and on the ecosystems. Why don't we start with like like how much damage are these causing, are these microplastic pieces causing to fish or to crabs? I know you'd looked at, and sort of just life in the river. What's the effect of having that much plastic doing to animals? And
so I suppose we don't specifically know the direct effects on the animal's health exactly, but we do know that microplastics and all plastics in general leach toxic chemicals into their environment. So if fish or other organisms ingest them, then they're potentially having these toxic chemicals leached into their bodies. And I suppose one of the main ways that they affect these animals is because animals are eating plastics instead of regular food. They're not getting the food that they need in order to grow and to reproduce and to meet their energy requirements.
I mean, does that, so they start eating the plastic and then they can't, they're too full to eat
essentially
the normal food, or is it like, I don't know, clogging up their digestive system, or like what's the what's going on there?
Well, it does a bit of both, really. In some animals, obviously, I'm sure you've probably seen photos of like turtles eating plastic bags and that kind of thing because they mistake them for jellyfish. So if a turtle were to eat a plastic bag, that would mean it would probably be full, and then it wouldn't eat the kind of food that it needs to be eating. And then also you have the other side of it. Alex's paper actually looked at mitten crabs ingesting plastics, and a lot of those were actually small plastics that tangled together and created like a big mesh inside the mitten crab's stomach, which obviously can cause like abrasion and other issues with inside the body.
Okay, so then if microplastics are causing this sort of problem to wildlife, then what's it doing to people? Do we have any idea about what it's doing to people, either through eating like seafood that has microplastics in it, or just sort of ingesting them directly through water or other drinks?
As far as I'm aware, there aren't any studies yet that actually show the direct effects of humans ingesting microplastics. We know we are because there's microplastics in the air that we breathe all the time, so we're always taking them into our bodies, but there's no studies that have looked at how they're affecting humans inside. But we do know that obviously they are being passed on, like you say, through the consumption of things like shellfish, because mussels are an organism that are quite well known to ingest plastics, and then obviously humans consume mussels, so it gets passed on through that route.
Yeah, you may have seen as well. Oh, sorry to interrupt. There was an article in the Guardian. There was an article in the Guardian this week, and it was looking at microplastic ingestion by babies, because they're bottle fed with I think it's polypropylene bottles that are used, and then they ingest millions of microplastics just through being bottle fed. And they, the scientists said from that paper, we don't know what the health effects are, but yeah, we do know that we are ingesting these plastics, and as Katie said, in seafood as well, because things like mussels, oysters, they're filter feeders. They're very prone to the ingestion of microplastics in their environment.
I suppose part of the issue is as well, microplastics have really only come into public attention within the last, they've been researched for quite a few years, but they've only, become a major talking point within maybe the last 5 to 10 years. So there aren't any long-term studies that could look at the effects of microplastics in humans over a certain amount of time.
Definitely.
So when did this, like, it's the fact that they're airborne is even more terrifying, like as if we don't have enough things that we can't see in the air to be scared of these days.
Yeah.
But like, when did you like, you kind of mentioned there's a new problem, and as it's something I came across a few years ago when an ex-girlfriend of mine started putting our clothes in a bag to wash them, and I was like, what are you doing? And she tried to explain to me about microplastics, and I was like, really? There's like all these tiny bits of plastic in the water? Surely someone would be freaking out about this. Like, why do you think that is that there hasn't been like any, like, that much study of the area? Surely Surely this is like a really terrifying thing to discover for like the human race, that we've all got these tiny little bits of plastic floating around in the air and all our water, and
I suppose ignorance is bliss, isn't it, really? As long as we don't know what they're doing inside our body, people aren't too worried about them.
I think, oh, sorry, I cut out a little question. But one thing I was going to say is that I think with microplastics, sort of the visual effects of harm, aren't really there, whereas it's very easy to, get concerned about these larger bits of plastic when you see, these shocking images of seals with, fishing line around the necks and that sort of thing. With microplastics, it's very difficult to actually, visualize this harm, which is why I think, in a way, it hasn't really come to light, because it's not what people see, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it doesn't gain the same public attention as seeing, like you say, a turtle or a seal with fishing line wrapped around its neck. People often can't see microplastics at all. So, out of sight, out of mind.
Definitely.
Where did you guys first come across the term, and then why did you decide that you wanted to do some research into it? Like what was it that inspired you to do that?
I can't actually remember when I first heard about microplastics. I suspect somewhere along the line of my degree, and during my third year, my undergraduate project was looking at I was looking at sea turtle populations, but not in regards to plastics. But then obviously, the sort of focus on that sort of area brought to light the issue of plastics and other forms of pollution in the ocean.
I think for me, it was our supervisor, Dave Morritt, at our university. I was in his marine biology lectures, and we had a lecture on microplastics. And I remember just being, stunned and shocked by it, and it really, really sparked my interest. And I think that summer that was in my second year, and I was going to Greece for an ecology field course, and they had some microplastics work going on there, where they'd look at microplastics in the stomach of mackerel. And on our last day, we got to do our own individual research project. And of course, everyone was going off on these kayaks, going to look at sea urchins. And I was the only person who wanted to be in a lab dissecting fish guts to look for plastic. And sort of from there, I then did work in my third year research project. Outside of that, I did a lot of plastics work in the Bahamas. And then I did a master's. And so I just got completely immersed. I think it's a brilliant topic, brilliant subject to be involved in. It's so new and current in a way now, because people are beginning to realise the effects of it. And it's great to be part of this new research.
So is there, what do you think the long-term consequences are that we're looking at of the water being infected with or infested with plastics? Like how long do you think it's been an issue that we didn't notice it as an issue? And how quickly do you think we can try and move away from the kind of plastics that are producing the microplastics?
It's probably been an issue for about 100 years now, because plastics, I think, were being produced initially in the 1920s. And obviously, ever since they've been created, we've had to find more and more ways to dispose of them. And for people who have no idea about proper disposal of these products, they'll just end up, on the ground somewhere or chucked in the water. So I suspect, obviously, they wouldn't have been a massive issue when they were first produced. But, since people started using them for almost every part of our daily life, they're just becoming more and more of an issue.
Yeah, I think a long-term effect of having plastics disposed of improperly and in the marine environment is that we know that these plastics will break down into microplastics and they will persist. So long-term effect is that we will just end up with more microplastics in our marine environment, especially if these plastics are just left to break down, because unfortunately with microplastics, they break down in smaller and smaller pieces, but they never actually go away. So that's why when looking at the solutions for plastic pollution, it's really important to stop these larger bits of plastic, especially getting into the wrong environment in the first place, because it's far more difficult to remove, microplastics when they are broken down, because they're just everywhere.
That's really scary that they never go away, that they're literally permanent. That was basically my next question. Like, eventually, will they just break down to something so small they become negligible to wildlife, or is that wishful thinking?
I don't think they do, because I think essentially once they get to the size of a microplastic, obviously there are lots that we can't see with the naked eye, but those are ones that Kate and I have both looked at, and they're still causing issues even when you can't see them within the naked eye's range. So they're always going to be an issue. And it's like you say, it's very scary to think that these plastics are persisting for so long. I think plastic bags take something like 20 to 50 years to break down.
And we now know a new category of plastics called nanoplastics. So, the size fraction below micro. So I think that is future, research as the impacts of nanoplastics now. Wow. Scary stuff. Yeah, there's a scary fact for Halloween that I see pass around. I've seen pass around for the last few years, is that every single toothbrush you've ever used is still out there somewhere.
I didn't know that. That's horrible.
Yeah, there's a scary Halloween fact for you.
How many toothbrushes has that got to be per person? Like, I don't know, how long does a toothbrush last? Like, max 6 months, maybe max. And then what's the purpose? So I've definitely got at least 50, 60 toothbrushes out there.
Yeah, whether they're still in, their original form or microplastic form, they'll still be there. Yeah. Wow.
So there's been some like programs like the I think it's the Ocean Cleanup Project, talking about how they might remove the Great Pacific trash pile, and try and and just lots of different people working on projects. There's like harbor drains and stuff to try and take like larger pieces of trash and plastic out of the oceans. Is there any way of capturing or filtering out microplastics, like even just from our drinking water? Is there a way that we could eventually like capture it as it comes through our like water system?
I suppose so. I read about, I can't remember his name now, but there was a young researcher who had found a way of filtering microplastics from water. And obviously my research used equipment that obviously filters out microplastics in order to see them. It's just obviously making that widely available to treat drinking water, I think, would be quite a mammoth task.
Yeah, I do think that is a possibility in things like washing machines for drinking water, etc. But the difficulty of microplastics is that once they're in the marine environment, you can't then filter them out because of their size. If you want to filter that part of the ocean, you'll end up filtering the base of the food chain out of the ocean, because that's where the zooplankton, phytoplankton sit as well, and microplastics will be among them. And you can't really do that. And also, not just in the marine environment, we need to think about removing plastics from, but also we know that these plastics are airborne. I don't think it's any coincidence that Dyson have moved from vacuum cleaners to air purifiers. And if you've seen the Dyson Award, that's recently been given to a group of students who've created this device that sits in front of a car tyre, and it will remove the plastics from the air as the tyre's going round. So that's something we need to consider as well if we want to remove plastics too.
That's a really interesting little note about Dyson moving into air purifiers. Do you really think that's where they're going? Is for microplastics, or do you think it's just for like air pollution, or would you count microplastics as a form of air pollution?
No, definitely. I've looked at the filters, and they've got a filter for the organic pollutants in their air purifiers, and they've also got one to capture particles in the air. I do believe they are quite on it with microplastics. Dyson have done work in rivers as well before, where they've created it's like almost a Catherine wheel for the river, and as the river flows, this wheel turns and it's got little pockets in, and it captures the plastics in those pockets and then deposits them onto like a conveyor belt above the wheel. So they have been involved in plastic pollution projects before. So yeah, I do think they are they are on it with microplastics, definitely.
Wow. Okay. I didn't realize James Dyson was this far ahead of the curve. Like, that's impressive. I thought, he was just about making things that sucked.
Yeah, very futuristic company. Yeah, do admire them.
It says, what's it say here? It says there's 500,000 tons of tire particles annually produced in Europe alone. And globally, it's estimated that tire wear accounts for nearly half of road transport particulate emissions. Wow. I had not even considered that the tires on cars might be making pollution. I was more worried about the engine.
Yeah, I think that's what the problem's been. Sort of people have been focusing on whether it's electric, petrol, whatever. But yeah, in terms of microplastics, it's actually the tires that they're the problem.
Wow. So, what is our outlook for this in the future? Like, do we have some kind of plastic or fiber or material that we know doesn't produce microplastics that could be used as a substitute for plastics? And what are the kind of problematic plastics that we're maybe not thinking of? Is there any other examples like the tire pollution that we've just sort of referenced?
I know lots of companies are sort of moving into trying to create bioplastics or biodegradable plastics, which obviously provides a lot of potential for moving away from generic plastics, but they've still got a long way to go with these products because a lot of them are labelled as biodegradable but actually aren't. So obviously people feel confident in buying these sorts of products, not really knowing where they end up either. So it's almost the same issue again.
Okay. What about like hemp plastic or there's some other synthetic like plastics and materials. You can get like bamboo fibers that make like really strong materials. Like, do they? I hope that if there's those kinds of like bioplastics, that they're not going to be producing like their own tiny little particles, or maybe I'm mistaken.
I think I do think things like hemp and bamboo tend to be better. I've actually got I don't know if you've ever heard of Peeler, the phone case company. They've made biodegradable phone cases, and I switched one out when I got a new phone and chucked it on the garden to see if it would work, and it actually did break down, which was really clever.
That's cool.
I think they're looking at seaweed as well as being a potential.
Yeah,
I've seen so in countries where they use kind of items packed in smaller packages to make it more affordable for people, they have these sachets, and they're using, or they trialed seaweed, making these sachets out of seaweed. So, and they're fully, and you can drink the seaweed as well when it dissolves. So they're using it things like housing coffee. So you can just pop the sachet in your mug, pour the hot water on, the whole thing will just dissolve, and you can drink it as well. So there are definitely new materials coming in, which is really, really good to see.
That's cool.
That's similar to I don't know if you've ever ordered products from Lush. They have, the sort of packing peanuts that you get. The ones they've created, you just pour them into the sink, pour water on them, and I'm not sure what they're made of, but they just dissolve and wash away. They're brilliant.
That's really cool.
I'd be tempted to check that now, given that we've just talked about how there's lots of things that look invisible and yet are there, as to exactly how small or how dissolved they are. I'm gonna be super skeptical of anything that says it like, I don't know, dissolves or disintegrates. Now I'm gonna be like, yeah, but is it really gone? You're gonna make me super paranoid about all of this. So is there new research that you guys are working on? Is there anything that you are either reading about of sort of interesting pieces of research into this, or perhaps conducting yourselves?
I'm currently not conducting any research at the moment. I'm just in regular employment. But our colleague Alex is still doing her PhD looking at the ingestion of microplastics in, I think she's been looking at mitten crabs, deep sea fish, some whales, some seals, basically any kind of organisms that she can get access to, I think.
Yeah, I'm currently not doing my own microplastics work. I'm looking for opportunities at the moment in environmental consultancy and that sort of field, so I can actually do something, about this problem. But I do like to keep up to date with microplastics research, and something that I find quite interesting is they're now looking at microplastics as potential vectors for disease. So microplastics can have this biofilm around them, which can house pathogens, potentially antibiotic resistant bacteria. And because plastics, they are persistent, they can travel, there's now the idea that, these microplastics could act as vectors of disease, or aiding the spread of antibiotic resistance bacteria through just purely, traveling through the water system. So if you think about in the water, what would usually be there, it would be organic matter, sort of leaves, twigs, etc., that would flow through the river, but they would break down. So they're sort of, the distance they can travel has a limit. But with plastics, because they persist, they can, travel far and wide. So yeah, there is this new problem. I think that's really interesting. I think more research to come on that would be brilliant.
Yeah, I read some similar stuff to do with that, and not only microplastics acting as a vector for it, but also larger pieces of plastic. As Kate said, they persist for so long, so they're really good, almost rafts for bacteria, and also invasive species from other countries that could potentially be coming over, and obviously that brings with itself more problems on our native wildlife.
So what you're saying is that the disease like sticks basically to the biofilm that's like around the plastics, and then sort of lives there until it can, I don't know, jump off on something else. That's scary. Especially yeah. So what you're saying is that microplastics caused COVID.
Oh, there's another conspiracy theory to add to the list.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's just it's an insane list of crazy theories that people have got about it. The worst bit is like a friend of mine sat and just this is we'll get back to plastics in a second, but a friend and I sat down and like wrote down just what had happened, like with coronavirus, like in the most basic language possible. And it just reads like a conspiracy theorist wrote it. Like that's literally how it reads. It's like you don't have to exaggerate anything, but it just sounds like someone has made it up. It's like this virus just appeared in Wuhan, China, near a biological weapons lab that had been sanctioned for safety violations. And then the entire world shut down, and they took away all our rights and civil liberties for a while. Like that's literally what. Like that's just it's so ridiculous when you think about it.
It does sound so made up, because I remember right at the beginning of lockdown, one of the most highly recommended films on Netflix was called Pandemic, and it was essentially about what's happened in the past year, but it was made last year.
Right.
That's insane.
That's crazy. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I just find myself watching like Contagion and all like disease related films, and there's one from the 80s with Morgan Freeman in it, which is absolutely amazing. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's Dustin Hoffman, and they start talking about the film comes to an end with like this army major trying to blow up like an entire city to hide the fact that he was responsible for this disease. It's like it couldn't be more 80s if you tried. It's fantastic. So like how scared, to get back to the kind of the topic I asked you guys on for, I want to take advantage of your knowledge. So in terms of the future, like how terrified or optimistic are you for I don't know, how much impact this is going to have on just like aquatic populations, on maybe like wildlife as a whole, upon ecosystems, and you know, perhaps our ability to either solve it or whether it's going to be a serious issue? Because if like you're saying, it's been around for 100 years and we're only realizing now, is that because it's not that bad, or is that because we've made it a lot worse recently?
I think it's a combination of, we have made it worse recently, and also we now have the technology to be able to study these things. You know, 100 years ago, we didn't have microscopes that could ever look at microplastics, whereas we now do. But yeah, I guess I try not to remain terrified about the situation, but I'm also not optimistic. I think I would say I'm sort of in between on the level of cynical. So I think obviously there are things we can do in the future to try and sort of stop adding to the problem, but I also don't think we can ever reverse the problem. Like we will never be able to remove all of the ocean's plastic, and especially not all of the ocean's microplastics. And that's only looking at the ocean and not taking into account other environments like air pollution, soil pollution.
No, I think it is a real issue, and it is something to be concerned about. But I do think that we could turn the tide on this. As Katie said, I don't think we could ever make the planet perfect, remove all plastics, but I do think there's a lot we can do sort of now, and we need to do now, to not make this problem worse. I think we've shown some quite good moves in the last few years, for example, with the microbeads ban, plastic bag charges, incentives for bringing people's own reusable cups and that sort of thing. And I think we've just got the wheels turning on this, and I do think maybe I'm a little bit I'm quite positive. I think we've seen some really good changes, and I think there'll be more to come.
So what can we do now? You mentioned there are some things we can do. Like what can we do at the moment?
We can switch from single-use plastics. Like Kate said, there's obviously lots of incentives now for people bringing reusable coffee cups and things like that. Switching out, plastic shopping bags for reusable bags, or, different, like we said earlier, moving to different types of materials. So a lot of bamboo products are being produced now. I use bamboo toothbrushes instead of plastic ones now, and you can get reusable face wipes instead of using wet wipes. There's lots of options now. So, on that front, the same as Kate, I am very positive about the sort of options that we're being given in order to switch.
Yeah, I think, there's lots we can do in terms of behaviour change. I think the key with plastic pollution, I don't know if you've ever heard Richard Thompson speak, but he's got this wonderful metaphor for plastics. He describes it as this, like the issue of an overflowing bath. So if you go upstairs, your bath is overflowing. What do? Do you mop the floor, or do you turn off the tap? And I think that can really relate to this problem of plastic pollution, where the key now is that we really do need to turn off this plastic tap. And that, as Katie said, can be through behaviour changes. So not, needing, not using this plastic, thinking of new materials we can use instead. But it has to come as well from sort of this top-down influence as well. So we do need, supermarkets and manufacturers to not be producing this plastic in the first place, looking for alternatives and making sure when they do produce plastic, it can actually, be recycled and put into a more circular economy. And so one way they can, do that is design plastics for end of life. So, for example, bottles that have colour in, they're far more difficult to recycle because the colour in the plastic, so if you have a bottle that's, orange, green, the value of the recyclate is decreased if it's got colour in. So making, bottles all clear, for example, will give the recyclate a higher value. So you can then, it gives companies more incentive to then actually recycle, because they'll make profit from it, and they can turn that material into something of a higher value. So it's just thinking more carefully about what we do with plastics and how we do design for end of life as well.
Surely if we're just going to continue to use the plastics and recycle them, then they're going to keep producing microplastics, or are you suggesting we should try and find the plastics, is there types of plastics that don't produce microplastics at all, or do we need to get to that recyclable point, or the like bioplastic point?
They
I
all
suppose,
oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I suppose the issue isn't necessarily that all plastics create microplastics. It's that plastics that are disposed of incorrectly create microplastics in environments where they shouldn't be. So if, for example, if someone doesn't recycle something, or even, I've seen plenty of people like littering single-use face masks at the moment instead of putting them into a bin. So obviously, as they degrade, on the road, those microplastics are going to be released into the environment, into the air, or if they're chucked into a waterway, then they'll degrade in that environment. And again, that's where they're going to create issues. So if, plastics themselves aren't the issue, we started using plastics because they're a very, very valuable resource. They're such a good material, especially when you consider things like medical equipment. It's just how we dispose of it. So if we're disposing of things properly, they're not going to be such an issue in the future.
Okay. Kate, did you have anything?
Oh no, I think Katie explained that beautifully. Yeah, I was going to say the same. It's that plastics aren't the problem, they're a very good material, but it's how we dispose of them currently that is the problem. If you encourage plastics to actually be recycled and to go into what we call circular economy, then you are preventing them from entering the wrong environment where they can produce microplastics and cause harm. So, yeah, what Katie said.
So, do you think that this requires something beyond just like an approach in Britain? Because surely, if the microplastics are enduring for a long time, and then they are getting transferred potentially all around the world through the oceans and waterways and whatnot, surely that we're going to need a global agreement to basically all recycle our plastic? Or is there, I don't know.
I feel the onus lies on countries like the UK or the USA as well, because as with a lot of environmental issues, especially climate change, communities in developing countries are often the ones that are most impacted by this, and they're also the ones who are contributing the least to it. So it should be our responsibility to essentially clean up our own mess and not make it into an issue for other people who don't have the money and resources to fix it for themselves.
I think
especially when they're not creating the problem in the first place.
I think companies as well, they have, global stretch. So I think there is, a big responsibility on companies and corporations to actually, be responsible for their plastic waste. We have the example of Walkers, producing all of these crisp packets, but don't, take responsibility for cleaning them up. So it's, I think companies as well.
Okay. So if you had to like lay out some, so far in the UK we've had legislation to stop plastic straws and some plastic bags, and I think there's like some new regulations coming in on trying to reduce all the non-reusable plastics, although as you sort of mentioned, that was pre-COVID, before we all started getting our disposable masks. Like what would be the biggest targets for you for trying to reduce microplastic pollution? Like where would you start? Would it be with like saying, okay, we're gonna change the type of plastic we're using? Would you say, okay, we're gonna like ramp up recycling? Like where would be your focus?
I think I'm biased because my research paper was specifically looking at wet wipes, so I do think they are a huge source of microplastics in the environment, and they're something that could very easily be banned. But also I think we do need to improve our recycling processes, and that often, just comes with clearer guidelines. A lot of products aren't labeled very well, so consumers don't know the best way to recycle them. So we need better guidance for consumers when they're buying these products, because like we said, plastic products aren't the issue, it's how we dispose of them. And if people just simply don't know how to dispose of them properly, then that's, that should be on the government to make sure that there are sort of certain regulations when producing these products, that they also come with clear guidelines.
Definitely, I really agree with what Katie just said there. I think sort of to prioritise this, I think it's really important to get the materials and what we actually produce first sorted, and then sort of have this big push for recycling, because at the moment, as Katie said, it is confusing, and we are producing a lot of materials that cannot be recycled or are very difficult to recycle. So getting on top of what we produce first and then improving our recycling, I think, would be the way around to do it.
Like, most people wouldn't consider wet wipes to be something that's plastic or is producing microplastics. Like, how much damage are they actually causing on that? Because I know you looked at, I think what you described them as wet wipe reefs.
Yeah.
Like just how many are of them like building up on the bottom of the Thames, and how much damage are they actually causing?
I mean, it's another one that's very difficult to actually quantify. My research, I worked with a charity in London called Thames 21, who do river cleanups, and every year they do what they call their big count, which is where they go and count the number of wet wipes along this section of the foreshore of the Thames. I think when we went with them in 2019, they counted 25,000 just in one stretch. And that's, of course, only down to a certain depth within that area of the foreshore, because they do create these ginormous, they are like reefs, they're like big mounds of, thousands of wet wipes that are all compacted together.
Does anything live on it? Like, life's pretty abundant, and was it Dr. Malcolm from Jurassic Park says life will find a way. Like, do you see, has there been like signs of adaptation to like these varying environments, or is it just like choking the life out of the river ecosystem?
I think the issue is, because to us, 100 years of plastic seems like a long time, but in terms of evolution, no organism is going to adapt to that kind of environment in such a short space of time. So what my research actually found was that the plastics are having an impact on, populations of invertebrates. I specifically looked at a species of clam, and it was, very clear to see, without even doing any data analysis, that the clams couldn't exist in high numbers where all of these wet wipes were, because they just cover the surface and they essentially can't breathe underneath a whole mound of wet wipes. So it's suffocating wildlife, essentially.
So like, is that like really destabilizing the ecosystem, or is it just killing it? Like, is it affecting like a particular, is it just affecting like the clams or invertebrates like you looked at, or did you find that you could see it affecting the entire ecosystem?
Well, obviously I didn't look at any other species in particular, but just looking at one species is always a good indicator of how it may be affecting other species. And the clams that I looked at are an invasive species in the UK. So obviously, in terms of conservation, they're not particularly important, and no one cares about them, and with good reason. But that does obviously pose problems for our native wildlife, and that's something that we do really need to be, conservative of, because we don't want to lose our native wildlife. And if it's having these horrible impacts on very competitive species, then other ones that are considered less competitive and less likely to survive are not going to have a chance.
Well, that's kind of scary. If the scavengers start dying, then we're screwed. If the rats and the seagulls all started leaving, we'd probably see that as quite a serious problem. in terms of like how toxic the environment was. So do you think it's just out of sight, out of mind in terms of why this isn't a bigger issue? Because we just can't see what's happening on the floors of the ocean. Like the oceans are like vastly unexplored, and we just don't have like a good grasp on exactly how the entire ocean and waterways of the whole world sort of function together. Is it just like a lack of being able to see what the damage is that makes people sort of not concerned about it?
I think maybe it's, you know, a touch of ignorance, really, because yes, there are obviously aspects of it that are very difficult for us to actually study, but there's so much research out there. I mean, you know, even just looking at David Attenborough's documentaries, there's so many resources for people to learn about these things, but the people who know so much about it are the ones who go out and do the research for themselves. So what we really need is sort of some kind of government strategy, e.g. a Green New Deal, that starts delivering this kind of research to people more readily so that they don't have to go out and find the information for themselves, because not everyone will be inclined to.
Okay. So one final question to wrap up here. Like what would you say that the best thing that people can do to either reduce their microplastic creation, or, you know, to stop fueling this apparently not very nice vicious circle of plastic and pollution? Like where can we start, like personally, on an individual level?
I think a good place to start, especially in COVID, is to use a reusable face mask if you can. I think that's something that's really surprised me, actually, is, you know, we had such a positive attitude towards, you know, bring your own plastic bags, go shopping, bring your own reusable cup. But then as soon as this pandemic has come along, I don't know about you, but I think the split that I've seen of sort of reusable masks to disposable ones is, you know, 60 disposable, 40 reusable. So, you know, I was quite surprised by that. So I think in terms of what people can do now, I think it's just thinking more carefully about, you know, the plastics they're using, because often when they are using plastics, they don't need to, and there are alternatives. But I think as well, we do need, as I've said, this, you know, top-down influence as well. I think, you know, it's a lot of pressure to put on somebody just to say, you know, reduce your plastic waste in the, you know, the society we currently live in. I think there are things you can do in your own, you know, personal life, and there are choices you can make. But yeah, it's made quite difficult at the moment. For example, when you go shopping in the supermarket, and you're almost having to make these ethical choices about, you know, picking up food, about which one has got the better, you know, packaging on, or whatever. So I think there's a lot that can be done there.
It's definitely a bit exhausting sometimes. You got like every decision in the 21st century has some sort of horrible, unforeseen impact. But the masks thing is really interesting, actually, that you mention it. Like I kind of think the reason that people are still going for disposable masks is that they don't see it as something that they want to buy permanently, because that's accepting that they'll have to use it permanently. Maybe, I don't know. I was considering the other day, I was like, maybe they just don't want to buy, you know, it's like if you,
it's like giving in to something you don't really want to do.
Yeah.
Which I you know, I can see, but yeah, you know, I unfortunately, whatever your stance is, I think, you know, we are going to be in this sort of pandemic for the long term, or the consequences of this pandemic for the long term, in terms of you know, face mask wearing, etc.
It's ironic though, because like you say, obviously people perhaps don't want to buy into it, but reusable face masks are actually a lot cheaper than buying the big packs of disposable ones.
I looked on Amazon to see how much a big pack would be, and it was ridiculously expensive. I think I've got 4 masks which I you know, go through the washing machine and can reuse, and you think, gosh, people must be spending so much money on disposable ones. But I think the problem really, a lot of people are actually then almost not using these, you know, single-use masks once. I see a lot of people, getting on the tube, they get a mask out of their handbag, which is absolutely filthy, that they've obviously been using for the last like 4 or 5 days. You think, really?
Yeah. But then at that point, I think if you're just like pulling it out of your handbag, you're wearing it because you have to, not because you're trying to prevent some kind of disease spreading. It's more of an obligation than you're doing it for the reasons that you're being asked to wear it. So I think I think there's going to be a lot of interesting psychological research into people's mask wearing things in the next year or so. I think so. Yeah, I think there'll be some seriously interesting stuff brought out. But anyway, I have got another call here at 11, so I'm going to have to run. But it was an absolute pleasure, ladies. Thanks very much for terrifying me and making me really paranoid.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the links in the description below. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.